In this final video, we're going to speak about three major ways the social determinants affect specific populations and outline common factors that fuel health inequities. Broadly speaking, the social determinants can differentially affect populations by way of exposure, vulnerability, and consequences. Firstly, differences in exposure. Let's talk about poverty here. People who experience poverty are likely to be exposed to higher levels of stress due to economic uncertainty than their wealthier counterparts, so those people higher up the social gradient. Regarding vulnerability, and still working with an example of poverty, people who have little or no income may be more vulnerable to health conditions owing to an inability to pay for regular health checkups, poor nutrition, or financial distractions that result in health issues being ignored. What do we mean by consequences, and how these might be experienced differently? Well, if you have money, if you have a stable job and stable housing, illness may mean a few days off work or paying a small sum for treatment. Whereas if you are living in poverty, it may mean the difference between keeping a home and homelessness. When we seek to pitch an intervention, whether it's downstream, midstream, or upstream, we are typically seeking to address one or more of the factors listed on screen, factors that are important determinants of health and health inequities. So let's work through how, specifically, each factor may impact health and health outcomes. These coming slides are the subject of a few quiz questions, so make sure you know where to find these slides when it comes time to complete quiz number 2. Let's begin with economic factors. How might economic factors impact health? As mentioned, poverty can impact housing stability and access to healthcare. Unemployment, particularly long-term unemployment, can impact mental health and is associated with depression. Not having money is associated with high-risk behaviours and exposure to violence. Economic inequality, generally speaking, increases stress and is associated with higher mortality, which is something we touched on in our first video of the social determinants this week. Social support, or social inclusion or exclusion, which is a determinant close to my heart. Being meaningfully connected to others is positively associated with health and well-being. Social isolation and social exclusion, on the other hand, is associated with decreased life expectancy, decreased health and well-being. In terms of specific outcomes, we observe increased rates of addiction, depression, smoking, stress, and anxiety among people who experience social isolation. What about education? And this is something that came up in our earlier discussion about the social gradient. Having a formal education is a health enabling factor. It's associated with greater health literacy, higher income, and more lifestyle choices. In comparison, people with no formal education are more likely to be unemployed or in harder working environments, such as those involving physical labour or risk to health. Let's talk about racial or ethnic bias. So race is a huge determinant of health. For example, in my research of trans and gender diverse adults, there is a wealth of research into the experience of violence that trans people face. What is often overlooked, however, is the fact that trans women of colour bear the brunt of transphobic violence. Race is a critical social determinant of health. Racism, or racial bias if you like, results in social exclusion and, important for our purpose as future health professionals, can affect diagnosis and treatment. Social norms or acceptance of behaviour. We've mentioned social norms a few times, most frequently in our discussion of culture. Different societies have different takes on health conditions. For example, in Euro-Western settings, being gender diverse places you within the scope of the DSM, so that Diagnostic Bible of Mental Illnesses. In other countries, such as the Philippines or Canada, gender diversity is seen as a natural continuum of gender expression. The influence of mass media. We cannot avoid the influence of media. The media is implicit in discussions of health and representations of certain images or norms of health. An often cited example is how, in the 1950s, smoking was portrayed as something that was glamorous and exciting. Now smoking is an accepted health hazard and is not present in Australian media at all. Politics is another social determinant of health. Politics can impact health by passing legislation and implementing policies. For example, removing or labelling on cigarette packages. Policies have the potential to impact health in terms of changes to the availability of affordable housing, improvements to public transport systems, the management of human waste, and whether or not the treatment you need is subsidised. Living conditions can also impact health. Whether you have physical safety and security where you live, whether you live in an overcrowded home, how safe it is for you to walk home at night, whether you experience violence and aggression from your neighbours, and whether you are able to get warm in winter. These are all critical factors of living conditions that impact health. If we zoom out a little more from living conditions, we end up talking about geography, which is where specifically you live. Whether, for instance, you live in a rural, remote area or in a major city. What kind of opportunities there are for you there in terms of employment, access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and access to education. And linking back in with our discussion about social support, whether you feel socially connected where you live or whether you are isolated. And finally, culture, something we are hopefully very familiar with now. Culture was the subject of our Week 4 discussion. This concludes our discussion of the social determinants of health, our Week 5 material. If you're interested in learning more about the social determinants of health, I encourage you to look up Michael Marmot, a key figure in the conceptualization of social determinants of health. There are a few good presentations by him on YouTube. Here is one such link on screen. Thanks for watching the 3 videos on the social determinants of health. If you haven't already, please jump over to the discussion board to complete activity 5.1. Bye for now.